The research station called Fulcrum 9 floated in the cold silence of deep space, orbiting a dead star that had collapsed into itself a billion years ago, and most of the crew agreed that nothing interesting ever happened there until the day they brought the orb on board. It arrived, sealed inside a containment pod, recovered from the ruins of an Aethan burial vault, on a planet so old that its name had been forgotten by every species in the known galaxy, and lead researcher Torvon stood in the main lab, watching as the pod hissed open and revealed what lay inside. The object was about the size of a human fist, perfectly round and impossibly smooth, made of a dark material that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. And across its surface ran patterns so small and so intricate that they looked like the veins of a leaf or the branches of a frozen river, shifting and rearranging themselves under different angles of light in ways that made the eyes ache if you stared too long. They called it Object 77, Lament. Torvon leaned forward and studied it with the cool confidence of someone who had spent 40 years working with alien relics, and his crystalline skin caught the lab lights and scattered tiny rainbows across the walls as he moved. Because the Valesi were like that, beautiful and brilliant and very aware of both facts. "Begin standard activation protocol," he said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. Over the next 6 days, 14 different species tried to wake the orb up. The Valesi went first, running precise energy pulses through it at frequencies that had cracked open artifacts from a dozen other precursor civilizations, and the orb sat on its pedestal and did absolutely nothing. The Gorvathi tried gravitational manipulation, surrounding the orb with fields strong enough to crush starship hulls, and the orb ignored them completely. Used psionic resonance, flooding the room with coordinated telepathic waves from a circle of 12 minds working in perfect harmony, and the orb remained cold and dark and silent. The Dirin tried emotional attunement, because the moth-like Dirin could feel and project emotions with a sensitivity that bordered on the supernatural, and a young researcher named Scytha pressed her delicate hands against the orb and poured warmth and curiosity and welcome into it for nearly an hour before she finally stepped back, exhausted and disappointed. Species after species came and went, each one bringing their most advanced tools and their deepest understanding of precursor technology, and each one left with nothing to show for it. This was not surprising, because no one had ever activated an Aethan artifact, not in the entire recorded history of the galaxy, and most researchers had quietly accepted that the Aethan relics were beautiful and mysterious, and completely, stubbornly dead. On the 7th day, someone remembered that they had not yet let the human try. Dr. Elena Vargas was not hard to find, because she was always in the same place, sitting in a corner of the lower observation deck with her legs crossed and a physical notebook open on her knee, sketching the structural patterns she had observed on the walls of the burial vault where the orb had been found. She was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy knot, and hands that were always slightly smudged with graphite, and she had been assigned to Fulcrum 9 3 months ago as part of what the Galactic Academic Council politely called a Diversity Integration Initiative, and what Elena privately called the Token Human Program. Humans were new to the galactic stage, barely 2 centuries into first contact, and while they had earned a grudging respect for their adaptability and their stubbornness, no one in the serious academic world considered them peers. Not yet, and possibly not ever. When the message arrived telling her to report to the main lab for her turn with the artifact, Elena closed her notebook and walked through the long, curving corridors of the station without hurrying, because she had already guessed that this was a formality and nothing more. She was right about what they expected, but she was wrong about what would happen. The lab was nearly empty when she arrived, because most of the senior researchers had already moved on to writing their reports about how Object 77 Lament was just another beautiful piece of dead Aethan stone, and only Torvon remained, standing near the door, with his arms folded, and his expression suggesting that he had better things to do. "You may proceed," he said. Elena walked to the pedestal and looked down at the orb, and for a long moment she simply studied it the way she studied everything, quietly and carefully, and with the kind of patient attention that most people mistook for slowness. Then she picked it up. It was heavier than she expected, and cooler than the room should have allowed, and she turned it in her hands, and watched the microfractal patterns ripple and shift across its surface, like something alive, and she felt a strange pull in her chest that she could not explain, something between sadness and recognition, as if she had picked up a letter addressed to someone she had once known. Nothing happened. No lights, no sounds, no energy spikes on the instruments that lined the walls. Torvon made a small sound that might have been satisfaction, and turned to leave. Elena set the orb back on its pedestal, opened her notebook, and wrote a single line in her small, neat handwriting before she walked out of the lab. She did not look back. If she had, she would have seen what Sitha saw. The young Deheran had been watching from the corridor, her wide, luminous eyes fixed on the orb through the glass partition. And she saw something that made her breath catch and her wings press flat against her back in shock. The fractal patterns on the surface of Object 77 Lament shifted. Not randomly, not in response to light or temperature or vibration, but deliberately and directionally, flowing across the dark surface of the orb like iron filings drawn toward a magnet, and they moved in exactly the direction that Elena Vargas had walked. Scytha stood very still for a long time after that, her antenna trembling, and she said nothing to anyone, because she was not yet sure what she had seen, and she was afraid of what it might mean. That night, long after the station had dimmed its lights and the crew had gone to their quarters, a security camera in the main lab recorded something that would later be watched over 400 times by researchers who could not believe what they were seeing. Object 77 Lament, sitting alone on its pedestal in a sealed and empty room, rotated 2.7 degrees to the left, toward the section of the station where Elena Vargas was sleeping. And in her quarters, lost in a dream she would not remember in the morning, Elena turned in her sleep and pressed her hand against her chest, because something in her heart was aching with a sadness that did not belong to her. Scytha did not sleep well for 3 nights after she saw the orb move, and on the 4th night she stopped trying to sleep at all and went to the main lab at an hour when the corridors were empty and the station hummed with the low, quiet sound of machines keeping everything alive. She stood in front of the glass partition and watched Object 77 Lament sitting on its pedestal in the dim blue light of standby mode. And she asked herself whether she had imagined the whole thing, whether her dear insensitivity had played tricks on her, whether she was about to embarrass herself in front of the entire research team. Then she pulled up the station's internal tracking system on her personal console and found Elena Vargas listed on Deck 4 in the recreation area. And she looked at the orb, and the orb was oriented toward Deck 4. Elena moved to the cafeteria on Deck 2 an hour later, and Scytha watched the orb shift on its pedestal by a fraction of a degree. Was oriented toward Deck 2. She tracked them both for 3 days. She did not tell anyone what she was doing, because she was a junior researcher, and she was Deheran, and the Deheran were respected for their empathy, but not always for their scientific rigor. And she knew that if she brought a wild claim to Torvon without hard evidence, he would dismiss her the same way he dismissed Elena. So she gathered her evidence carefully and quietly, logging every movement Elena made through the station, alongside every corresponding shift in the orb's orientation. And by the end of the 3rd day, she had a dataset with over 200 paired observations, and a correlation so perfect that no honest statistician in the galaxy could call it coincidence. She found Elena on the observation deck, sketching as always, and she sat down beside her and showed her everything. Elena stared at the data for a long time without speaking, and Sitha could feel the emotions rolling through the human-like weather, surprise and confusion, and a deep, unsettled feeling that was not quite fear, but lived in the same neighborhood. "That cannot be right," Elena said. "I have checked it 9 times, Sitha said, and her voice was soft, because Diren voices were always soft, but there was iron underneath it. They ran a blind test that same night, because Elena was a scientist before she was anything else, and she needed to see it for herself before she could believe it. The plan was simple, and Elena walked a randomized path through the station, generated by a program that even she had not seen in advance, while Sitha stayed in the lab and recorded the Ord's orientation at 30-second intervals. And when they compared the 2 datasets an hour later, they sat in silence for a very long time. Perfect correlation, every single data point, 100%. The orb was following Elena through the station the way a sunflower follows the sun. Elena brought the findings to Torvon the next morning, and she presented them calmly and clearly, with all of her data organized and her methodology transparent. And Torvon listened with the expression of someone being told that water flows uphill. "Sensor drift," he said. "The sensors were recalibrated yesterday," Elena replied. "Confirmation bias in your observation protocol. The path was randomized, and I had no knowledge of it in advance." And Sitha recorded the orb's position independently. Torvon's crystalline face hardened in a way that made the light scatter off it in sharp, angry patterns. And Elena understood that this was not about the data, because the data was clean, and they both knew it, and this was about something older and uglier, the simple refusal to accept that a human might matter in a room full of species that had been exploring the stars since before humanity learned to make fire. "I will not log this officially," Torvon said, and he turned away from her, and the conversation was over. Elena stood in the corridor for a moment after he left, and the anger in her chest was bright and hot, but she did not let it show on her face, because she had learned a long time ago that being angry and being right were 2 different things, and only one of them would get results. She went to Station Overseer Kethran instead. Kethran was Gorvathi, which meant he was nearly 3 meters tall and built like a wall that had decided to grow arms and legs. And his armored hide was the color of old iron, and his voice sounded like boulders grinding together at the bottom of a canyon. And he was the most fair-minded person on the station, because the Gorvathi believed that facts did not care about your feelings, and neither should you. He reviewed Elena's data, asked 4 precise questions about her methodology, received 4 precise answers, and granted her access to the containment lab. Formal proximity test. The next day, Elena stood alone in front of the sealed door to the containment lab, and she could feel her heart beating in her throat. And Sitha stood behind the glass, with her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. And Kethran stood beside Sitha, with his massive arms folded, and his expression unreadable. Elena stepped through the door. The moment she crossed the threshold, every instrument in the room screamed to life. Object 77 Lament did not just glow, it opened, and Elena would spend the rest of her life trying to find words for what she saw in that moment, and never quite succeeding. The dark surface of the orb peeled back in layers like the petals of a flower made of night, and beneath it was light, not the cold light of a star or the harsh light of a lab lamp, but something warm and layered and alive. A lattice of interwoven threads that pulsed and shifted in patterns that reminded Elena of breathing, of heartbeats, of the rhythm of someone crying. A sound filled the room, low and resonant and so deep that Elena felt it in her bones, more than she heard it with her ears. And it was not a word, and it was not a song, but it was unmistakably a voice, something reaching out across 1,000,000 years of silence, to say the simplest and most desperate thing any living creature has ever said. "I am here. Are you there?" Elena felt something brush against her mind, Not pushing, not forcing, just touching. The way you might reach out your hand in a dark room to see if anyone was standing beside you. And it was not hostile, and it was not warm. It was curious, deeply and achingly curious, as if something very old had just woken up after a sleep so long that it had forgotten what waking felt like, and was trying to understand what kind of creature had finally come to find it. Then Elena stumbled backward, because the presence was too much and too vast and too sad. Like a fist, and went dark, and the instruments fell silent. And Elena stood in the middle of the room, shaking and breathing hard, and trying to remember how her legs worked. On the other side of the glass, Scytha had tears running down her face, because she had felt the edges of what Elena had felt. And Kethran had not moved at all, but his hands were trembling, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. The energy spike was detected by every sensor on the station, and within an hour, everyone on Fulcrum 9 knew that the dead relic had woken up. Torvon arrived at the lab, demanding that the orb be quarantined and Elena be removed from the project immediately, and his voice was loud and sharp and full of something that sounded like authority, but was really just fear wearing a mask. Kethran looked at him with the steady patience of a mountain watching a storm, and said 6 words that changed everything. She stays, because she is the variable. In the containment lab, sitting alone on its pedestal in the dark, Object 77 Lament waited with the patience of something that had already waited for more than 1,000,000 years, and was now, for the first time, willing to wait a little longer. The question burned through Fulcrum 9 like a fire that no one could put out. And it was the same question in every language spoken on the station, whispered in corridors and argued in labs, and debated over meals by species that had never agreed on anything before. Why the human? 14 species had touched the orb, and 14 species had been ignored. And among those 14 were civilizations that had mapped the quantum structure of reality, and civilizations that could fold space with their thoughts, and civilizations so old that they had watched stars being born and dying and being born again, and the orb had treated all of them like furniture. And then a human woman, with graphite on her fingers and a notebook full of sketches, had walked into the room, and the most ancient artifact in the known galaxy had opened its eyes for the first time in over 1,000,000 years. Torvon threw himself into the work with the kind of fury that brilliant people use to hide the fact that they are afraid of being wrong, and he ordered a complete neurological scan of every species on the station, starting with Elena and ending with Elena, because he ran the scan on her 4 times before he accepted the results. What he found made him sit down very slowly in his chair and stare at the wall for 20 minutes. Every species on the station had a brain that was organized, efficient, and specialized, because that is what evolution does over millions of years. It takes the wild tangle of early neural development, and it prunes and refines and optimizes until what remains is a clean and powerful instrument perfectly suited to its purpose. Human brains had not done this. Human brains were a storm, and Torvon had never seen anything like it in all his years of comparative neurology, because Elena's neural scans showed a level of crosstalk and interference and overlapping signal paths that by any rational standard should have made it impossible for her to function at all. Her emotional centers were tangled into her reasoning centers, which were tangled into her memory centers, which were tangled into her sensory processing, which was tangled into everything else. And the whole system was firing constantly in a cascade of competing signals that looked less like a brain and more like a thunderstorm trapped inside a skull. In a Velasy brain, a thought was a clean line from input to output, like light moving through crystal. In Elena's brain, a thought was an explosion that touched everything at once and left nothing unchanged. Her mind is chaos, Torvon said to Kethran, and his voice was quiet in the way that voices get when someone is rearranging everything they thought they knew. "Is that your explanation?" Kethran asked. Torvon closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had shifted behind them, something that might have been the beginning of humility in a person who had never had much use for it before. "The Aethin were the most advanced civilization we have ever discovered," he said. "And they vanished without violence, without catastrophe, without any external cause that we have ever been able to identify. And the only things they left behind were these artifacts sealed in burial vaults on dead worlds. And we have spent centuries assuming that the artifacts were broken, or that we were missing some key. But what if they were not broken? What if they were waiting? What if the Aethin designed them to respond to a very specific kind of mind? A mind that does not think in straight lines, a mind that feels before it reasons, a mind that is messy and loud and chaotic, and alive in a way that no refined and optimized neural architecture could ever be." The room was very quiet. "You're saying the relic needed a mind like hers," Kethran said. "I am saying the relic needed a mind that none of us have," Torvon replied, and the admission cost him something that showed on his face even through the crystal. Sitha had her own theory, and she shared it with Elena one evening on the observation deck, while the collapsed star turned slowly outside the window, like a dark jewel set in nothing. "The Aethin artifacts are always found in burial vaults," Sitha said, and her wings folded and unfolded slowly, the way they did when she was thinking deeply. "Never in laboratories, never in military installations, never in places of government or commerce, always in places of mourning. And I have been reading the inscriptions that other teams have translated from Aethin sites across the galaxy, and they are not scientific texts, and they are not records of achievement. They are elegies, Elena. They are songs of loss. They are the words of people who were grieving something so enormous that they carved it into stone so it would outlast them." Elena looked at her and felt the weight of what Sitha was saying settle into her chest, like a stone. "You think the orb is not a tool," Elena said. "I think the orb is a memorial," Sitha said, "and I think it was waiting for someone who knows what grief feels like." Over the following weeks, Elena conducted a series of careful, controlled interactions with Object 77 Lament, entering the containment lab alone each time, and letting the orb open at its own pace. And each session, it opened a little more, and reached a little further, and showed her a little more of what it carried inside. The impressions came in fragments, like pieces of a dream that you try to hold on to after waking. And Elena filled notebook after notebook with descriptions and sketches of what she saw. She saw cities that were not built of metal or stone, but of light itself, vast and beautiful, and humming with a harmony that made her want to weep, for reasons she could not name. She saw the Aethin, and they were not what anyone had expected, because they had been a species of flesh and blood and warmth, long before they became whatever they became at the end. And in the oldest memories the orb showed her, she saw them laughing and arguing and holding each other, and being afraid, and being brave, and being all the things that living creatures are when they are still close enough to the ground to remember what it feels like to fall. And she saw what happened to them. They had evolved beyond physical form, transcending their bodies in a process that took thousands of years and was celebrated as the greatest achievement of their civilization. And when it was done, they existed as pure consciousness, vast and immortal, and connected to each other and to the fabric of reality itself in ways that no physical being could comprehend. And it was not enough. Because when they left their bodies behind, they left something else behind too. Something they did not realize they would miss until it was gone. And that something was the ability to feel loss, to feel the sharp, specific pain of loving something that could break, to feel the terror and beauty of being small and temporary, in a universe that was neither. They had become gods, and in becoming gods, they had lost the one thing that made existence bearable, which was the knowledge that it would someday end. The grief that followed was beyond anything Elena had ever imagined. The grief of an entire species, realizing that they had traded their hearts for their wings and could never go back. And in their final act, before they vanished from the galaxy entirely, they had poured that grief into objects of dark stone and sealed them in vaults, and sent them out into the universe, like messages in bottles thrown into an ocean they could no longer touch, hoping that someday something that still knew how to cry would find them and understand. Elena sat in the containment lab after the last session, with tears drying on her face and the orb glowing softly in her hands. Understood now what it wanted, and it was the simplest thing in the world. It wanted to be mourned by someone who still knew how. The news could not be contained, because discoveries like this are bigger than any security protocol, and within days, the entire galactic academic community knew that a human had activated an Aethan relic, and within weeks, a delegation from the conclave of elder species was dispatched to Fulcrum 9. They were led by Archon Yseal, a Valesi politician whose beauty was matched only by her ambition, and she arrived with a diplomatic cruiser and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a team of specialists who carried equipment that Elena did not recognize. But before any of that arrived, during a deep interaction session that Elena almost did not survive, the orb showed her one final thing. Not a memory this time, but a warning, a vision of the relic being forced open by hands that did not understand what they were holding, and the grief inside it erupting outward like a wound that would not stop bleeding. And she saw what happened to the minds that were caught in that flood. And it was worse than death, because death at least was an ending, and this was a sorrow that would never end. Elena pulled herself out of the session, gasping and shaking, and she looked at the orb, and the orb looked back at her with something that felt like fear. Something was coming, and the relic knew it before anyone else did. Archon Yseal walked onto Fulcrum 9 the way a queen walks into a room that already belongs to her, and her crystalline skin was polished to a flawless shine, and her robes were the color of deep space threaded with silver. And she smiled at everyone she met with the kind of warmth that had been carefully designed in a mirror. She brought 12 specialists with her, all Valesi, all carrying cases of equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. And she brought a diplomatic charter, signed by the conclave of elder species, that gave her authority over any precursor artifact deemed to be of critical galactic significance. And Object 77 Lament had been deemed exactly that, approximately 6 hours after the news broke. She met with Elena in the station's main conference room, and Kethran stood in the corner like a mountain that had opinions, and Torvon stood near the window, looking uncomfortable in a way that Elena had never seen on him before. Elena with her wings pressed flat against her back. "Dr. Vargas," Yseal said, and her voice was like music played on glass. "The Conclave is deeply grateful for your contribution to this discovery, and your name will be recorded with honor in the annals of galactic science. And I want you to know that your involvement has been remarkable, and that no one is suggesting otherwise." She paused, and the pause was the kind that diplomats use when they are about to take something away from you while telling you how much they respect you. However, the artifact is now classified as a Conclave asset under the Precursor Heritage Act, and my team will be assuming custody and continuing the research under protocols appropriate to an object of this magnitude. And we will of course keep you informed of any developments. The words were polite, and the meaning was not. And Elena sat very still for a moment, and felt the anger rise in her chest like a tide. "Respond to your people," Elena said, and her voice was calm and even, and this cost her more effort than anything she had done in the containment lab. It does not respond to any of the 14 species that have tried. It responds only to me. And I have spent the last 3 weeks learning how it communicates, and I need to tell you what I have learned before you do anything else." She stood and presented her findings, everything she had gathered from her sessions with Lament, and she spoke clearly and without hurry, and she laid out the truth of what the Aethan had been, and what they had lost, and what they had left behind. She told them that the relics were not tools, and not weapons, and not databases, that they were memorials, emotional time capsules containing the raw, unprocessed grief of a civilization that had transcended beyond the ability to feel. And she told them that the relics had been designed to respond only to minds that were messy and loud and emotionally chaotic, enough to resonate with what was stored inside. And she told them about the warning. "If you try to force it open," Elena said, and she looked directly at Yeziel because she needed the Archon to see that this was not politics and not pride and not a human trying to hold on to something that did not belong to her. The grief inside it will come out, and it will not come out gently. It is the sorrow of an entire species compressed into an object the size of a fist, and it will hit every mind on this station like a wall, and I do not know if everyone will survive it." The room was quiet, and for a moment Elena thought she saw something flicker behind Yeziel's polished expression, something that might have been doubt or might have been fear. Then Yeziel smiled again, and the moment was gone. "We appreciate your concern," she said, "and our specialists will take every precaution." The Conclave team began their work the next day, and they set up their equipment in the containment lab with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. And their instruments were beautiful and powerful, and designed to crack open things that did not want to be opened. Elena was not allowed in the lab. She stood behind the glass with Scytha, and watched as the specialists surrounded the orb, with devices that Elena recognized as forced resonance amplifiers, machines that could generate artificial psionic fields powerful enough to overwhelm any passive defense system. And she felt sick, because she knew what was about to happen, and no one was listening to her. The first pulse hit the orb, and nothing happened. The second pulse was stronger, and the orb shifted on its pedestal, as if something inside it had flinched. The third pulse was stronger still, and the orb went dark in a way that was different from its usual dormant state. Darker than dark, as if it was pulling light and warmth out of the room, and the temperature in the lab dropped so fast that frost appeared on the inside of the glass partition. "Stop," Elena said, but no one heard her, because she was behind the glass, and the specialists were focused on their instruments. The fourth pulse hit, and the orb cracked. Not a large crack, just a thin line that appeared on its surface like a wound. And through that crack came a sound that was not a sound, a frequency so low that it bypassed the ears entirely and went straight into the brain. And it carried with it the thing that Elena had been trying to warn them about. The grief hit the station like a wave. Scytha collapsed first, dropping to the floor with her wings wrapped around herself, and a sound coming from her throat that was not a scream and not a cry, but something worse. Something that sounded like a heart breaking in a language older than words. In the lab, 2 of the Conclave specialists stumbled and fell, and one of them began to weep with her hands pressed against her face, and the instruments were shrieking with readings that had gone far beyond their scales, and the lights flickered, and the station groaned as if the metal itself was in pain. The waves spread outward through the station, and everywhere it touched, people fell. In the cafeteria, a Gorvathi engineer dropped his tray and sank to his knees, with tears streaming down his armored face, and he had never cried before in his entire life, and he did not know what was happening to him. In the medical bay, a Thureni doctor curled into a ball on the floor and felt the most terrible sadness she had ever known, a sadness so vast and so old that it made her own long life feel like a single breath in an endless night. On the command deck, Kethran gripped the edge of his console with hands that could bend steel, and his whole body shook, because he was feeling what the Aethan had felt at the end, the unbearable knowledge that you have given up the thing that mattered most, and you can never get it back. Elena felt it too, worse than anyone, because the relic knew her and it reached for her specifically. And the grief crashed into her mind like an ocean pouring through a crack in a dam. And for a moment she could not see, and she could not think, and she could not remember her own name, because she was drowning in a sorrow that was 1,000,000 years old and as fresh as the moment it was born. But Elena Vargas was human, and humans are built for this. Not for joy, not for peace, not for the clean, crystalline clarity of minds that have been refined beyond the reach of pain, but for this, for the dark, and the weight, and the terrible beauty of feeling everything at once, and still putting one foot in front of the other. She dragged herself to the containment lab door, and she entered the code with hands that were shaking so badly she had to try 3 times. And she walked through the grief the way you walk through a storm. Hit her, letting it hurt. The orb was on the pedestal, cracked and leaking light that was the color of tears, and it was screaming in the only way it knew how, pouring out the sorrow it had held for over 1,000,000 years, because the crack had broken its control, and it could not stop. Elena picked it up. She held it against her chest with both hands, and she did not try to block the grief, or fight it, or push it away, because she understood now that this was not an attack. This was a cry for help. This was something ancient and broken and desperately lonely pouring out its heart to the only person in the room who could hear it. And she gave it the only thing she had. She gave it her own grief. She thought of her father, who had died when she was 17, and how she had stood at his funeral in the rain, and felt like the world had ended, and also like she had to keep standing because he would have wanted her to keep standing. Loneliness of the station, of being the token human, of working twice as hard as everyone around her and being half as respected, of smiling when she wanted to scream, and being polite when she wanted to burn the whole hierarchy to the ground. She thought of what it means to be small and fragile and temporary, and to love things anyway, knowing that everything you love will eventually be taken from you. And she held all of that up to the orb like a lantern in the dark, and she said without words, I know what it feels like. You are not alone. You were never alone. The crack in the orb sealed itself. The light steadied. The wave of grief that had been crushing the station receded like a tide, pulling back from the shore, gently, slowly, taking its sorrow with it, and leaving behind a strange and tender silence. Elena's legs gave out, and she fell to the floor with the orb still pressed against her heart, and the last thing she saw before she lost consciousness was the light inside the orb, shifting from the cold color of grief to something warmer, something that looked almost like gratitude. She slept for 9 hours. When she woke, she was lying on the floor of the containment lab, and the orb was beside her, resting against her hand like a small animal that had curled up next to someone it trusted. And it was glowing with a soft, warm light that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. It had chosen her, not as a user, not as a researcher, not as a subject, as a guardian. On the other side of the glass, Archon Yasiel stood with her arms at her sides, and her perfect composure shattered. And there were dried tear tracks on her crystalline face that she had not yet wiped away because she had forgotten they were there. And when she spoke, her voice was stripped of all its polish and all its diplomacy, and what was left underneath was just a person who had felt something she could not control. Conclave, she said to her aide, and her voice was barely a whisper. Tell them the human has bonded with the artifact. Tell them we need to reconsider our approach to all of the relics. And tell them, she paused and swallowed, tell them we were wrong. 3 months passed, and the galaxy changed in ways that no one had predicted, and that everyone would spend years trying to understand. The story of what happened on Fulcrum 9 spread faster than any official channel could control. Because stories like that do not obey protocols. They move through civilizations the way fire moves through dry grass, jumping from mind to mind and growing with each telling, until the entire galactic community was talking about the human who had held the grief of a dead civilization in her hands, and answered it with her own. The Galactic Academic Council held an emergency session that lasted 11 days, and at the end of it, they issued a declaration that was unprecedented in the history of interspecies relations. Humanity was granted full research partnership status in the Precursor Studies Division, not as junior members, and not as diversity appointments, and not as token representatives of a young and emotional species, but as essential collaborators without whom the greatest archaeological mystery in the galaxy could not be solved. Dr. Elena Vargas was promoted to lead researcher of a newly created division called the Aethan Memory Project, and she was given a staff of 40 and a budget that made her dizzy when she first saw the numbers. And she was given something else that mattered more to her than any title or budget, which was the respect of people who had spent her entire career looking past her. She had also learned to communicate fluently with the orb she had started calling Lament, and the communication was not like language, and not like telepathy, but something in between, a sharing of impressions and emotions and memories that flowed both ways like a conversation held in colors instead of words. What Lament told her over those 3 months changed everything the galaxy thought it knew about the Aethan. The relics were not isolated objects, Lament explained in its wordless way. Nodes in a network. Thousands of artifacts scattered across dead worlds throughout the galaxy, each one containing a fragment of the Aethan collective memory. And together they formed a complete record of everything the Aethan had been, and everything they had known, and everything they had felt. Their art, which was made of light and sound and emotion woven together in ways that made the most advanced holographic technology in the galaxy look like cave paintings. Their science, which had unlocked the fundamental structure of reality itself and found that at the very bottom of everything, beneath the atoms and the quarks and the strings and the fields, there was something that could only be described as longing, a desire built into the fabric of existence for things to connect and to know each other and to not be alone. Their philosophy, which had spent 100,000 years wrestling with the question that every conscious being eventually faces, which is whether it is better to be powerful or to be alive, and which had arrived at an answer too late. And their love, which even after transcendence, even after they had become something beyond physical form, still burned inside them, like a star they could see, but no longer touch. Each relic held a piece of this, and each relic was waiting, and they could only be opened by minds that felt deeply enough to resonate with what was inside. And among all the known civilizations in the galaxy, humans were the strongest match. Not the only match, Elena was careful to say, because Sitha's Diran empathy gave her a partial resonance that allowed her to interact with Lament in limited ways. And there were hints that a few other species might carry enough emotional intensity to activate certain relics under the right conditions. But humans were the key, the species that the Aethan had been hoping for without knowing whether such a species would ever exist. A species that had never evolved past its own emotional chaos, that had never refined its neural architecture into clean, efficient order, that had kept its storm of feeling and contradiction and irrational, stubborn hope intact across 100,000 years of its own evolution. Torvan came to Elena one evening while she was working late in her new office, which was 3 times the size of her old corner on the observation deck, and which she had already filled with notebooks and sketches and the comfortable mess of someone who thinks with her hands. He stood in the doorway for a moment and Elena could see that he was carrying something heavy inside him. Not grief this time, but something harder for a Valesi to bear, which was the knowledge that he had been wrong. "I need to say something to you," he said, and his voice was stripped of its usual authority, and what remained was just a person talking to another person. Elena put down her pen and looked at him and waited. "I dismissed you," Torvon said. "Not because your work was poor, because it was not. And not because your methodology was flawed, because it was not. But because you were human, and I believed that your species was too young, and too emotional, and too unrefined to contribute anything meaningful to the study of the most advanced civilization the galaxy has ever known." He paused, and the light moved across his crystalline face in patterns that Elena had learned to read over the months she had known him, and right now they showed something raw and honest and ashamed. "We spent 1,000,000 years refining our minds," he said, "cutting away everything that was noisy, everything that was messy, everything that hurt, because we believed that intelligence meant clarity, and clarity meant control, and control meant power. And we looked at your species and saw chaos and called it weakness." He met her eyes and held them. "You kept your hearts," he said, "and it turns out that was the greater achievement." Elena did not say anything for a long moment, and then she smiled. And it was not a triumphant smile, and not a bitter one, but something warm and tired and real. The smile of someone who has been carrying a heavy thing for a long time, and has just been told that it was worth carrying. "Thank you, Torvon," she said, and that was enough. The first expedition to an Aethan burial world launched 6 weeks later. A joint mission crewed by 12 species, with Elena at the head, and Scytha at her side, and Kethran commanding the security detail, because he had requested the assignment personally, and no one was foolish enough to argue with a Gorvathi who had made up his mind. The ship was called the Remembrance, and as it pulled away from Fulcrum 9 and turned toward the deep black between the stars, Elena stood at the forward observation window and held Lament in her hands, and felt it pulse with something that was unmistakably excitement. Long imprisoned, finally going home. Behind her, the crew moved through their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that they were part of something bigger than themselves, and for the first time in the history of galactic cooperation, no one questioned why the human was in charge. Because they had all felt what she could do. Every single one of them had been touched by the wave of grief on Fulcrum 9, and every single one of them had felt it recede when Elena held the orb and answered its sorrow with her own. And that kind of proof does not require a committee to validate it. The burial world was 3 weeks away at faster-than-light speed, and in the evenings, Elena sat in her cabin, alone with Lament, and listened to the stories it told her in colors and feelings and half-formed images. Stories of the Aethan in their glory and their fall. Stories of love affairs between beings of light that lasted longer than most civilizations, were born as consciousness itself, and who laughed in frequencies that made stars ring like bells. And sometimes, Lament showed her simpler things, quieter things. An Aethan mother holding her child for the first time. An Aethan artist staring at a sunset and weeping because it was beautiful. An Aethan elder sitting alone in the dark, remembering someone who had died. And these were the memories that glowed the brightest inside the orb, because these were the ones the Aethan missed the most. On the last night, before they reached the burial world, Elena sat cross-legged on her bunk, with Lament resting in her lap, and the stars streamed past the window in long, bright lines, and the ship hummed around her like a living thing, and she felt the presence of the Aethan stronger than she had ever felt it before. Not as a ghost, and not as a recording, and not as an echo, but as something alive, and grateful, and present, reaching across a gap of 1,000,000 years to touch the mind of Someone who had come looking for them when everyone else had given up. A message formed in her consciousness, clearer than any impression Lament had ever sent. And it was not words exactly, but it was close enough to words that Elena could hold on to it and carry it with her for the rest of her life. "We forgot how to weep," the Athens said. "We forgot how to love imperfectly. We forgot how to be small and frightened and brave anyway. We searched the stars for a species that still remembered, and we found you." Elena closed her eyes and felt the tears run down her face, and they were not sad tears, and they were not happy tears. They were both at the same time, because that is what humans do. They hold contradictions inside themselves, and they call it being alive. "We remember," she whispered, and her voice was steady and soft and sure. "We will always remember." Lament pulsed once in her hands, warm and golden and bright, and for a moment the cabin was filled with a light that did not come from the stars or the ship or any instrument ever built, a light that came from somewhere older and deeper and more tender than any of those things. It was the light of something that had been alone for a very long time, and was not alone anymore. And outside the window the stars kept burning the way they always had, indifferent and eternal. But inside the small cabin of a ship called Remembrance, a human woman held the heart of a dead civilization in her hands, and promised it that someone would carry its story forward. And she meant it. And that, in the end, was the thing that made humanity different. Not their strength, and not their speed, and not their technology, and not their numbers, but the simple, stubborn fact that when they made a promise to something that was hurting, they kept it. The galaxy had finally learned what the Athens had known all along, that the universe does not need more power. Willing to cry,